by the Dallin Road Church of Christ. My name is Aaron Kemple, and with me is Ruben Prevost, one of my fellow evangelists here at the Dallin Road Church of Christ. How you doing?
Doing good, man. How are you?
I'm doing great. Doing great. Always good to have you with me here. Tonight we're talking about turn the other cheek. You know, we're going through Luke and Acts, right, as a church. And we've been preaching lessons on that, and we're studying it in our Bible classes and having Monday night studies about it as well. But tonight we're just going to talk about turning the other cheek. And so that's I'm looking forward to that. So
we actually see that concept in Luke 6.
Okay.
Right. We see the concept in Luke 6.
That's right.
And it's kind of one that's a little challenging and surprising. So I'm pretty excited about it too. I guess we could just pick up and start reading it. Luke 6, around verse 27. This is in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain, whatever you want to call it in Luke. So Luke 6, verse 27, Jesus says to them, "But I say to you who listen, love your enemies, do what is good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If anyone hits you on the cheek, offer the other also. If anyone takes your coat, don't hold back your shirt either. Give to everyone who asks from you, and from someone who takes your things, don't ask for them back. Just as you want others to do for you, do the same for them." And so that's sort of the section that we're talking about there, where we could read down to verse 36, but I think that encapsulates it. And so Jesus says, love your enemies and do what is good for those who hate you. And then he gives them a bunch of ways to actually do that.
Right.
He says, if anyone slaps you on the cheek, offer the other as well. If anyone takes away your coat, don't hold back your shirt. He says, give to anyone who asks you. And if someone or request or demands of you, might be a better translation. And if someone wants to take your stuff, just let them take your stuff. Don't ask for it back.
Yeah.
Right. And so those are like 4 things that he says, here's how you can love your enemy. And the question that really will come up as we're talking about this with someone else, or if you read this, is like, well, what do we do this?
Right.
How do we, what do we do with this? Because I mean, he says, Jesus says, hey, if someone slaps you on the cheek, give them the other cheek as well. And so, the question is, okay, well, what do we do? Do we retaliate? Do we not retaliate? Because I mean, that's the question. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts on this passage is just in general. And then we could talk about sort of what it means, I guess.
Well, I mean, if we just listen to what Jesus says, and then, like you said, if you read further, if you love those who love you, I mean, if we just like at it, just the first glance, and it's hard.
Yeah, it's not easy.
I mean, Jesus is asking a hard thing, and he did that before. He always does that. He's asking a hard thing. So that just at first glance, I mean, we don't want to say, we don't want to minimize this passage. We want to say what it says, but regardless, no matter how we look at this is hard.
Yeah.
That's just what that's my first response.
Yeah. Okay. And I think that's a good area where we can talk about for just at least a little while is what Jesus says is difficult, because if someone wrongs me, I want to figure out a way to like not talk to them or here's how I can hit back or
make them hurt, make them suffer
too. Yeah, make them hurt, kind of like how they made us hurt. And so, like, if someone wrongs me, that's going to change the way that I treat them. Right? That's typically how we act. Right? I mean, we all do that. We can all think of moments where someone has wronged us, where whatever it is, fill in the blank, and well, okay, fine. They want to treat me that way, then that's how it's going to be. Here's, and then our attitude towards that person changes. But what Jesus essentially says here is love your enemies. That's the first thing he says. People who wrong you, love them. And oh man, is that just those words are difficult. I think, sometimes we look at the words that follow in verse 28 through 32 or whatever, and like, man, that's difficult. But just those words in verse 27, love your enemies and do good to those who hate you. That in and of itself, I think, is a very difficult passage.
Yeah, I mean, and it deals with everything here. It deals with my heart. I got to love. So it's not like, well, I didn't punch him in the face. I hate his guts. Right? He didn't say that.
Yeah.
He said, love your enemies. He said, bless. So my mouth, I got my heart, my mouth, my body. I mean, someone smacks you, right? You turn the cheek. My possessions,
Yeah.
right? Your giving, right? So my generosity and even my desires. We may want them to really hurt and suffer. And we've talked about imprecatory prayers. There's a time for God for us to pray for justice, right?
Right.
But am I wishing them ill? Oh, I didn't get back at them, but man, I really wish that they'd suffer. Well, he says, whatever you wish that others would do to you, do to them.
Yeah.
So it's like it covers every aspect of this. He leaves nothing out in my being of how I treat my enemies.
Yes, that's right. And I think Matthew's account of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus really covers this because, sometimes we may think, I really don't like this person, but at least I don't, I've never hit him or anything. I've never, done I don't know. I've never done them wrong. I just don't like them. And Jesus kind of like throws that away a little bit as far as, look, yeah, you may not be murdering your brother, but if you hate him, you need to go and fix that.
Right.
You need to go and work that out. And so I think that right there is difficult. Just the idea of love your enemies. But then he gets into this other stuff of, okay, well, now if someone hits you on the cheek, don't retaliate, offer the other also. If anyone takes away your coat, well, don't hold back your shirt. Give to everyone who asks from you, and if someone takes your things, don't ask for them back. And so it seems that Jesus is saying, well, don't retaliate. I mean, that's what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, don't retaliate, but what do we do with that, and how do we apply that to our lives? Does it become this thing where, well, if someone breaks into my house, I just have to let them take my stuff. And that really, I think, is where people question this passage, where that's the questions that people have.
Yeah.
If someone is beating up on me just for no reason, what does that mean? How does this passage apply to me then? I think is
well, yeah. And there've been extremes either side. You've got the people that have the John Wayne philosophy. I'm not going to dial 911. I'm going to use 357. Right. But then you have the other extreme in the religious world where they believe when Jesus says, Matthew 5, or don't resist an evil person. And that's an added phrase too. And if, he adds that, we don't see that in Luke, I don't think, but they'll take that too. If you're, if someone comes in and rapes your daughter, I can't stop that.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
You can't, I can't do anything to stop that. Well, I don't think that's what Jesus meant. I don't think that's what he means in this context.
Right.
All right. Again, we're not trying to explain away the text. I mean, we don't want to be guilty of that. I know both of us agree on that. We don't want to explain away what he says, because what he says is very hard.
Right.
And this is what he expects of us. But there is a time when God is not asking us to turn the other cheek.
Right.
And we need to expect that, because even Jesus himself, and I know you're going to talk about some of that as well, there are times when we see Jesus having a different approach.
Right. Yeah.
But it's not talking about this situation.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. And I think we can see some of that from the context. And
yeah,
I recognize that maybe not everyone agrees with what we're going to say as far as how we should interpret this passage. This is one of the commentators, Del Ralph Davis, on Luke. This is and I actually really appreciate it, because I really appreciate the way he interprets this passage and talks about it. And so we'll just talk about some of that and what I see is going on in the context. So a lot of times in Luke, you have this contrast between two different people or two different groups. Luke likes to do that a lot. Max talked about that at one point. Max and I were having a conversation, how Luke likes to build these contrasts. You see it at the very beginning, where you have this miraculous birth, but the miraculous birth will happen to an old married woman. And then you have another miraculous birth that happens to a young unmarried woman.
Right.
Right. And so you have a contrast between these two miraculous births. We see the same thing in Luke 6 and verse 20. And you guys, if you're following along, we're just going to read verses 20 to 26 and just see if you can see, like, Luke is contrasting two different types of people, and you'll be able to see it. It's not difficult to see. And so verse 20, then looking up at his disciples, he said, Jesus, blessed are you who are poor, because the kingdom of God is yours. Blessed are you who are hungry now, because you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, because you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you, when they exclude you, insult you, and slander your name as evil because of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy. Take note, your reward is great in heaven, for this is the way their ancestors used to treat the prophets. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your comfort. Woe to you who are now full, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are now laughing, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you when all people speak well of you, for this is the way their ancestors used to treat the false prophets. And so you see that there are two types of people here. There are people who are blessed, God's people. I'm going to get my hand in frame. And there are people who receive this curse, this woe. And these are obviously wicked people. And we see the people who are blessed, God's people, and at least in this context, are people who are humble, lowly, right?
Mm-hmm.
People who are hungry, who are poor, who are weeping. And then the people who are cursed, the wicked people, at least in this context, are people who are wealthy, who are full, who are laughing. And we start to see why there's a difference between these people. Why are God's people suffering and the wicked people not suffering? Well, verse 22 gives us one part of the answer. Because there are people who hate them, who exclude them, who insult them, who slander their name as evil. And so there's persecution. Why are the righteous people suffering so much? Because they're being persecuted.
Yeah, on account of the Son of Man.
Yeah. On account of the Son of Man. They're being persecuted because of their faith in God.
Yeah.
And if you note in verse 23, he says, take note, your reward is great in heaven, for this is the way their ancestors used to treat the prophets. Whose ancestors? Their ancestors. And so what it seems that Jesus is doing is he's saying the righteous people that he mentions next, these are the people who are persecuting. Look at verse 26. What do you when all people speak well of you? For this is the way their ancestors also used to treat the false prophets. And so there are people who are persecuting the Christians. And it seems like they're there because Jesus, I don't know, he says their ancestors. Maybe he's pointing at this is the way their ancestors used to treat the prophets, in the same way they're treating you. Well,
I think you've made that point in another example where it's just that there's a great multitude, verse 17, right?
Yeah.
From everywhere, but he said to his disciples.
Right.
So they're out there as well.
Yeah.
John taught to the crowds, but he taught to the faithful, but the Pharisees were there too, and he condemned them, right? So yeah, you're right. And I think it's interesting. I haven't noticed that until just now, as you said that, but their fathers.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So their fathers persecuted the true prophets, and their fathers praised the false prophets.
Yeah, that's right. And so there are people there who are persecuting God's people and uplifting the wicked. Right. And so that's the context there. There are God's people, and God's people have enemies who persecute them because of the Son of Man.
Yeah.
Right. And so
you
now
can think of Ahab, you can think of the book of Jeremiah. These things happen in the Old Testament. Absolutely.
That's right. I mean, you think about, I was just reading, through Jeremiah and his life, and at the very beginning, Jeremiah is a young man, maybe in his late teens or whatever it may be, whenever God calls him and God says, I'm going to be with you. And if you get in trouble, I'm going to save you. But he got in so much trouble because he spoke the truth. Right. And so God's people have enemies who persecute them because of the Son of Man. And so verses 27 to 36 really is within that context where he says, love your enemies. These are people who are persecuting you because of the Son of Man. And so whenever you're talking about people who hit you on the cheek, well, that's someone who's hitting you on the cheek because of the Son of Man. They're persecuting because of the Son of Man. The person who takes away your coat, same thing. He's doing it because he's persecuting you because of the Son of Man. Give to everyone who asks from you. That's why I say probably a better translation is everyone who demands something from you. This is not just someone asking. This is as a part of persecution.
Yeah. Hebrews 10 talks about people they joyfully accepted the plundering of their goods.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's the idea.
Yeah.
And so these are, again, they're being persecuted because of the Son of Man. And so I think that really is the context. I don't think this is talking about, well, some robber just breaks into your house because he wants to take your things. Well, you can't defend yourself. I can understand how someone could get there, but I don't think that's within the context what it's saying.
No, and nor does it match with the way Jesus and Paul and others even live their lives. Right. And another point I think is, and I know you're aware of this, but if you look at Luke and Matthew, I mean, the Sermon on the Mount and this sermon, Jesus isn't rewriting new laws in the sense where the Old Testament was, just wipe out people in blood and wrath and judgment. And now, oh, it's love and grace. Well, the Old Testament said, love your enemies.
Yeah.
Right. The New Testament says, love your enemies. The Old Testament teaches this idea of turning the other cheek, loving your enemy, and actively loving your neighbor. Leviticus 19 and other places, I think, but also, in the Old Testament, in the middle of all those laws, God had laws of justice. God had laws of self-defense. If someone comes into your house, right?
Yeah.
You could defend your house, and you're not guilty of wrongdoing in that sense.
Right.
And God made that distinction back then. And I don't believe there's any indication in the New Testament that Jesus came along and wrote a new law.
Right.
So this is not talking about anytime someone does you harm and just, again, they're just kicking your wife's teeth in and you just stand there. Well, I'm supposed to turn the other cheek. That's not what he's talking about.
Right. Yeah. And that's a good point you're making, because what Jesus is doing in the sermon is teaching them how to really understand the spirit of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Right.
Which you've been big on teaching here. And I appreciate that,
Right.
Understanding the spirit of the Old Testament.
And so that it's not that, he's not saying, well, I know the Old Testament said you only have to love your neighbor, but now I'm saying you got to love your enemies too. No, that was love your enemies in the Old Testament. Right. It's definitely within the spirit of the law. If your enemy's donkey, is, in trouble, I forget the exact wording, go help him. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Love your enemy.
Yeah. The proverb says that, you don't bear a grudge. Right. And it says you shall reason frankly with you. Well, maybe that's in the law of Moses too, but it's everywhere.
Right.
Don't bear a grudge against someone, not against your enemy, but go reason frankly with. So that's in the Old Testament just as it is in the New.
Yeah. And
I think where people get tripped up, I know we're in Luke, but when you look at Matthew 5-7, he'd say, but I say to you, you've heard that it was said, but I say to you, but he's not quoting the law of Moses. He's quoting distortions.
Yeah.
And that's what they were hearing. And he is like, wait a minute, this is what the law is. And this is what the spirit of the law was all along.
Right.
So that's important, I believe, to put this in its context, to understand that God isn't creating a different law than what he created for how we treat our neighbor.
Yeah.
I know there are changes from the law of Moses to the new Moses, to the new law. Don't get me wrong, but God's spirit has been the same.
Yeah.
His basic characteristics, his basic requirements have been the same.
Yeah.
So
I guess what we could talk about here is, okay, so how can we discern when it's okay? Because I think that's something we do need to discern. It's clear it's clear what Jesus says. And again, we don't want to explain. Sometimes we can spend a lot of time explaining away what Jesus says just because it's difficult. And we don't want to do that. Like there are times where we should not retaliate. Right.
Yeah. So John 6, this is a hard saying, right? He didn't minimize it and say, oh, I'm sorry you didn't understand this.
Right. Yeah. And so how do we spend that time discerning? Or what can we do to discern, okay, well, when do we defend ourselves? When do we retaliate? When do, even speaking about someone speaking badly and I need to say something to defend my own name, right? Because I know, be real, that happens today. And that probably maybe happens more than the physical retaliation, sort of this verbal retaliation.
Yeah.
And so when is it okay for us to do that? I know I asked a similar question to the college age group on Thursday for the college study. And they had a couple of things on the board, and I don't remember everything they said, but I think one of it was really good. One of them was like, maybe when it's my ego on board, I need to see if it's my ego. We can talk about that here in just a moment.
Yeah.
But another thing that one of them said essentially had to do with, well,
I'm pulling up a picture.
Neighbor? Yeah, I knew you were taking the picture.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what was?
There you go. We're doing this. Yeah. Oh. Pardon. You can't see what's on my phone.
So the defense of others, I think that's really important because it gets back to the greatest commands of
that's right
of Scripture, of God's people.
Yeah.
Right. When Jesus asks what the greatest commands are.
Yeah.
And he asked the greatest commands in the law: love God and love your neighbor. Certainly those are also the greatest commands for God's people today. Love God and love your neighbor. And so you have to ask, if love your neighbor is such a weighty command, and now you've got this idea of, well, not defending self, which one weighs a little bit more? Probably love your neighbor, right? So love your neighbor weighs a little bit more. And so if I see my neighbor just getting wailed on, sorry, I can't defend you. Same thing you said, seeing your wife getting wailed on. No, I love my neighbor. And so I think
you're right.
With regards to this love your neighbor, there's an aspect where we can defend our neighbor. Right.
And even if it's our enemy are getting wailed on,
we're
not going to say, hey, you're getting what you deserve.
Yeah. Love your enemy.
right?
Yeah,
So
exactly right.
yeah.
I think a good example of this is actually the temple incident where
Mhm.
Jesus starts like throwing people out.
Yeah, he made a whip.
Yeah. Right. And so like we see some of that. I think Mark is a good a recording of that, because I think Mark has the perspective that I'm wanting to look at in Mark 11. But in Mark 11, around verse 15, it talks about how Jesus and the disciples, they came into Jerusalem, and so he went into the temple and began to throw out those buying and selling. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the chairs of those selling doves. He would not permit anyone to carry goods through the temple. He was teaching them, is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of thieves.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
Jesus here, I mean, it's clear Jesus retaliates in some way, but the question is, why is he retaliating? There are a couple of views on this. Well, he's retaliating because people are getting taken advantage of, right? This has become
clear.
A den of thieves, right?
Den of
people
thieves.
People are getting taken advantage of. And I think certainly that's true. So he's retaliating to help others, but I think it goes a little bit deeper than that too, because he doesn't just throw out the people taking advantage of others. He throws out the people getting taken advantage of too. Right. So he throws out not just the buyers, but he throws out the buyers and the sellers.
Yeah.
And so there's something else going on here. And I think it gets back to the words that Jesus says in verse 17, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations.
That's right.
What's going on here? They're buying and selling in the temple. And that used to not be done. It used to be done across the valley on the Mount of Olives, because where they're buying and selling would have been the court of the Gentiles, where Gentiles could come, and that's as close as they could get to God's presence, but they could come and learn about God in the temple.
Yep.
And now this place where Gentiles can come and learn about God and build a faith in God and become a child of God, because that was allowed even in the old law. Gentiles can come and become children of God.
That's right.
The place where they could go and become children of God has now turned into a shopping mall.
That's right.
And so it's like,
and so the poor are being taken advantage of, and so are the Gentiles are being excluded. So it's just like all around bad.
Right. Yeah. And so it comes to this point where, okay, in pursuit of love your neighbor, Jesus does retaliate in this sense.
Yeah.
So
as you're talking, I'm thinking, it was up here, but verse 16 of Mark 11. If I could make memes up right now and just throw them on the screen, it would just be like, resist not an evil one. He would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. Did he resist evil people?
Yeah.
Yes, he did.
Right.
So again, one way we can, determine what Jesus meant is look at how he lived it.
Yeah.
Right. We can look and see how Jesus lived it, because he's not going to contradict his teaching. He's not going to say, well, I'm above my teaching. He lived what he said. Right. So here it is. He resisted an evil one. Well, let's ask why, which we're doing, but why did he do that? And why did he later, when they're smacking him and beating him, he doesn't say anything? Why is he silent at that point and pretty loud here?
Yeah. And I think it gets back to sort of what we were saying, if I mean, you move into like later on in Luke 22 or so, whenever Judas is, coming to betray him, and he kisses him, and they start to arrest Jesus, and Peter, Luke doesn't say it's Peter, but Peter cuts off the high priest servant's right ear, and Jesus responds, no more of this. We're gonna do this a completely different way. And so Jesus is taken through trial, through the cross, and he doesn't retaliate at all. And so there are moments when Jesus does not retaliate, and there are moments where Jesus does resist evildoers. And we saw it here in Mark 11 with regards to the temple. And and the question is, okay, we've got to figure out how to discern when. Yeah. And that's the difficulty. There's not always going to be a neat answer where I can put up a flow chart behind us. Yeah. Because this is the green screen, so we can put whatever we want back here. Yeah. But put up a flow chart behind us and start like, okay, well, in this scenario you retaliate, in this scenario you don't. Some of it's just going to take some discernment, and some people might discern differently on some of the things. Right. But I think one of the guiding principles that we can use is, well, am I loving my neighbor in this or not? I think that's one of the guiding principles. Yeah.
Anyway. Lord, declare my heart to me, right? As David would say, expose my heart and show me, because I may be so absolutely determined that I am right and I am just and and I am right in my course. And maybe he's like, maybe you should just turn the other cheek.
Yeah.
Again, it's hard.
Right. It's difficult. It's difficult.
Right. So yeah, I think when you look at how Jesus lived it, there was a time when he was silent.
Yeah.
And there was a time when he was loud and he took over and he things like this. And I think we see the same thing with Paul.
Yeah.
There was time. Yeah, go ahead.
And I do want to get to Paul here in a moment, but we talked about how in Luke 6, how that's referring to like people who are persecuting you because of the Son of Man, right? It's not just talking about anybody who's doing any bad thing to you, but specifically persecuting you because of the Son of Man. But there was even an example, I mean, early on in Luke 4, where they're trying to throw him over a cliff in Nazareth,
right?
Because of his teaching.
Did he resist them?
And he like slips through them, he doesn't allow them to do that. And so
that,
clearly there's this moment of discernment, right?
Multiple times that happens. Yeah. John, I mean, there's John 5, John 8, John 10, they're trying to kill him.
Right.
He just passes through and goes and they don't get him.
Yeah.
They can't. So he resists an evil person.
Right.
He resists evil people at the temple. What did he call Simon? Get behind me, Satan.
Yeah.
That's resisting an evil person, right. I'd say.
Yeah.
Trying to think of other examples, but the way he talked to the Pharisees.
Yeah.
I mean, he was pretty loud and abrasive toward them, and I mean, listen to what he said to them. But there was a time for that. But then there's a time, like I said, that he said nothing at all.
Yeah. And so we getting into Paul, we can shift gears a little bit because we've been talking about more physical stuff, but maybe there's someone who doesn't like throw punches at me physically or attack me physically, but just attack my character and who I am. And I mean, if you know, but there's a reason why we're talking about this. There are things going on right now, and I'm sure it happens all over the place where people attack the character of other people. And so when is it when do we defend ourselves? When is it good? Because I think there are moments where you should just defend yourself, and there are moments where just looking at Jesus where he doesn't defend himself. And we could look at Paul, and there are plenty of times where he defends himself as well. And so what are some maybe guiding principles that we can
find out where okay. Like yesterday in our campus study that you led, and again, just did such a great job with that. But Jesus responded in different ways just depending on the situation. And I'm just going to throw these out here. I'm not saying we're going to answer all the questions because we can't. Again, like Ruben said, there's just times we're not going to be able to. There's times I'm going to speak when I shouldn't have. And there's times when I should have said something and I didn't.
Yeah.
Right. And that's how we learn discernment. We're like, well, okay, but Jesus, sometimes he gave a parable, and you read through the book of Luke. So he told them a parable. There's a time he responded to evil people with a parable, a story.
Yeah.
Sometimes he responded with, it is written. Sometimes he responded with questions. Sometimes he didn't answer at all. Sometimes he walked away.
Yeah.
And those are, I mean, if you read through Luke or any of them, it just, he departed, he turned from them and walked away. Those examples are throughout Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's a time to turn and walk away. There's just they said, tell us plainly, and he's like, I told you, and you don't believe. I think it was John 10, right? And so sometimes he rebuked them, and sometimes he called out their hypocrisy. But what we have to do is, like you said, and that's what the college students were saying yesterday, well, is this about my ego? Or is this really about defending others and furthering the gospel? And I think that's what we see with Jesus, because he was protecting others by cleansing the temple.
Yeah.
He was protecting others because the way the Pharisees were behaving, it's not about hurting him. They were hurting others. And that's where I think what we see with Paul, there was a time when he stood up, and the reason why he defended himself was because of the gospel. Yeah. And he defended himself because of what was happening to others, not necessarily what was happening to him.
Yeah. And I think a good example of this, I was skimming the letters of Paul real quick, and I was wondering how many times Paul mentions early on that, Paul, an apostle. I was just wondering, he even mentions it in 1 Timothy, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus. Like Timothy doesn't know, but he mentions it. Maybe there's something going on in Ephesus. I don't know at that time. But in Galatians, that's how he starts it. And he starts it actually even a little differently than he typically does, because he mentions that he's an apostle, Paul, an apostle, but he says, an apostle not from men or by man, but by Jesus Christ. And so other times he might say, I'm an apostle of Jesus Christ, or an apostle or something along those lines. But this time he specifically says, I'm an apostle, not from men or by man, but by Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And that's important, because what Paul goes on to do in the letter to the Galatians is he goes on to defend his apostleship.
Mm-hmm. Tied to the gospel.
Right. Yes. And so there are people who are saying, Paul's not a real apostle.
Right.
Paul he heard the gospel from the guys in Jerusalem. He heard the gospel from the real apostles,
mm-hmm.
and he just kind of took that and did his own thing with it. And so he's not a true apostle. You don't need to listen to what he says. Instead, here's how you're saved. You're saved by doing all this stuff and circumcision.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's sort of the backdrop. And the way we get that from the letter to the Galatians is by mirror reading. Right. I know
mm-hmm.
there are kind of
mm-hmm.
pros and cons to mirror reading, but what we're doing is we're reading what Paul says in the letter, and we're like, oh, so there must be this problem. Right. So
right.
That's how we're reading it. There may be pros and cons to that, but I think that's what you kind of have to do.
That in 2 Corinthians as well, you can tell there are people who are attacking his authority as an apostle.
Yeah.
And it's the same people who are teaching a twisted and perverted gospel.
Yeah.
And so he's not defending Paul just to defend Paul. It's not just his ego's hurt.
Right.
He's doing that because the gospel's at stake and people are being taught a false gospel.
Yeah. And so we see some of that. Well, I'll come to that. But in Galatians, it's evident in Galatians 1 and 2. You see it all over. He's defending himself, right? And he's defending his gospel because people are speaking ill about it. And so he says in verse 11, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel preached by me is not of human origin. It's the same thing he said earlier in verse 1, where he says, I'm an apostle, not from men or by man. So there's something going on here, it seems. It's not from human origin. Verse 12, I did not receive it from a human source, and I was not taught it, but it came by revelation of Jesus Christ. Look, guys, I'm a real apostle. He's defending himself, but the question, and you've answered it a couple of times, is why? Mm-hmm. Verse 6, he says, I'm amazed that you are so quickly turning away from him who called you by the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so that gets to the why of him preaching this. He's preaching this because other souls are he's defending himself because other souls are at stake.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because there are people who are turning quickly away from him who called them by the grace of Christ Jesus. That's why he's defending himself. And I think it's important to point that out.
Yeah. And what's happening, and just to say it, as generic as I can, what happens among the brotherhood is a man gets attacked, and then you got people attacking the man and others defending the man. And we're not even talking about the real issues. We end up talking about a person.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And so what we see here with Paul is his goal was, I'm not the issue here. Let's talk about the issue, and that's the gospel. He defends himself, but it's all centered around what's the gospel say?
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes we got to be careful of, personalities. And this has always been true. I've watched this as long as I've been a kid, or as long as I've been alive, that people have made it about people. And when we started dancing around, I remember you talking about this, where you were just talking around an issue. We're not really talking about the issue, know? Well, let's break out the issues. But if we're making it about a person, we're making it about egos, we've missed it.
Yeah.
We've missed it.
And I think that's important. That's one of the things someone put on the board was it was because of our ego. I remember it, right?
Yeah.
Are we doing this because of our own ego? Am I doing this just because someone hurt me? Right. And I don't think that's necessarily what we see with Paul. Paul defended himself a lot.
Yeah.
And I think there comes a point where you have to someone is saying all this stuff and you have to defend yourself.
There is a time where you have to.
But we've got to look internally on that, because I don't think Paul is defending himself because his ego was bruised. As a matter of fact, we see whenever he's in prison, whenever he writes the letter to the Philippians, he says, look, there are people who are preaching Christ out of envy and all of this. But that's okay, because the gospel is being spread. Mm-hmm. Right? If it was just about his ego, he would have had quite a different response. And same thing what we see here in the letter to the church in Galatia, or the region of Galatia. What he says here is, this is about look, you guys are turning from the gospel. And so I need to tell you that the gospel that I received was not from human origin. As a matter of fact, whenever I was saved, I didn't even go immediately to Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
I would encourage you to read Galatians 1 and 2. And just he makes a really like a lengthy defense of his gospel and how he got it. But it's not about him and his ego. You know, you had a good passage, I think, from Job in Job 40 that you mentioned on the other day, Job 40 verse 8.
Yeah, it's interesting when you think about Job, that, you know, Job is such a long book. And usually when I grew up, we'd hear about Job, like the first couple chapters and the last couple chapters. But in the middle, I mean, you have Job, well, in the beginning, Job loses everything. We know that Satan attacks him. But then his friends are just back and forth, attacking Job's character and saying, you're suffering because you're sinning. And what happens, it seems that at times Job is spending more time defending himself than he is glorifying God. And I believe that's what God says to him in Job chapter 40. He says in verse 6, the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, dress for action like a man. I will question you and you make it known to me. Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be in the right? And so it seems that he had gotten distracted. I think that's what Elihu says to him in an earlier chapter, whether or not Elihu was all what he should have been. It seems that was the point. You're spending too much time defending yourself, Job, right now, and you got caught in a trap defending yourself, and that's going to get you in trouble with God. And I believe that there's a point when we go too far defending ourselves and we take it away from the glory of God. We've turned it into making about us. Yeah. And that is that's a slippery slope. And I've done it myself, but we end up making it about ourselves and our own rightness.
Right.
And that is so tricky to get caught up in that, man.
Yeah.
So easy to happen.
Yeah. I like the way the CSB translates it. Would you declare me guilty to justify yourself? Mm. And that's what God is telling Job. Would you declare me guilty to justify yourself?
Yeah.
And so there can come a point where we're justifying ourselves and it's all about me. And maybe that's the wrong motive in it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something to recognize. I think I don't think there's a thing where it's like, well, you're defending yourself and that's wrong. I don't think it's wrong to defend yourself.
No, it's not
whatsoever. And I think that there comes a time where,
and there's even a time to defend yourself publicly.
Yes. Yeah.
I think
and Paul does that. Apparently, again, people are spreading all of these rumors about Paul, like, oh, you're not a real apostle, and you really just stole the gospel from the real apostles. Yeah. And apparently that's being spread. And he sets out a public defense of himself.
He sure does.
There comes a point where I think you have to do that. Mm-hmm. We just have to monitor our own motives. Monitor our motives.
There's a title.
Yeah.
I think there's a sermon Ruben's going to preach.
I think that's important.
Yeah. I was thinking about Psalm, which is search my heart. Psalm 139, search my heart, try me, seeing if there's any wicked way in me, especially when our emotions are high. It almost sounds like the Crucial Conversations book, but when the stakes are high, emotions are high. And the stakes are high because, whether it's a family or a church or at work, whether it's our influence or a marriage or whatever that is, you think about, man, the stakes are high and emotions, man, when you get attacked, it's everything within us. They're like, well, I want to defend myself. Well, let's think about, do I have the Spirit of God as I'm doing it?
Yeah. One of the things in the sermon, in Jesus' sermon, whether it's in Luke 6, and this is kind of how much time. Yeah, this is kind of where we can call it to a close is we need to think about what the response is going to be, how other people are going to view whatever it is, because there's a point that Jesus is making in the sermon, whether you look at it from the perspective of Luke in Luke 6 or from Matthew in Matthew 5. And the perspective is we've got to be different from the rest of the world. Do you see the way the rest of the world treats their enemies? We need to make sure that we are different.
Yeah.
And the phrase I used in the sermon that I preached on this was Jesus calls us to be not conventional, but exceptional.
Exceptional. I love that.
We've got to be quite different from the rest of the world. And there's a reason why we've got to be like, as a matter of fact, that's what he says in Luke 6, whenever he talks about, he says, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. Mm-hmm. Like, we're not called to be like the rest of the world. We're called to be exceptional. If you do good, verse 33, if you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. No, we're called to be exceptional, right? And so on and so forth. If you lend to those who lend or from whom you expect to receive, what credit is that? Even sinners lend to sinners to be repaid in full. And so we're not called to be the same as everyone else in the world. We're called to be exceptional. And the reason why we're called to be exceptional is because, and we don't see it in Luke, but we see it in Matthew, this idea of being lights to the world. Like other people should see us and be like, wow, those people are really different.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to be a part of that.
Mm-hmm.
That's how people in the world should see us.
Yeah. I mean, sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah.
Well, I was just thinking about, I mean, we talk about defining marks of Christianity, and sometimes it's all these outward things about what a church does or doesn't do. That's the defining mark of Christianity. Okay. Well, how about how do I respond when I'm deeply hurt, when I'm offended and I have been unjustly treated? How do I respond is what's going to show the Spirit of Christ to the world.
That's right. Oh, and
that is the defining mark of Christianity.
Yeah, that's right. And this is, I just thought of it. It just popped into my brain, and I knew it was something I wanted to mention, but I didn't write it down. But I saw this here recently, and I thought it was a really good quote. Someone said, "We judge ourselves by our intentions, but we judge others by their actions."
Mm-hmm.
And I thought about that. I'm like, that is so true.
It is very true.
Like, because I can do the same thing that other person did, but I'm going to judge myself by my intentions because I intended the right thing.
If they do the same thing, we'd call it foul or penalty, as my sermon was. We'll call a penalty a foul.
Yeah.
But we find a clever way to justify it in our minds when we do it.
Right. And I thought I was like, man, that's really good because it's so true. Yeah. And so we've got to be careful with how we're dealing with people. Mm-hmm. In other words, and again, it's because of lights. If people see Christians just retaliating like everyone else, is that going to draw people to Christ?
Mm-hmm.
If people see a bunch of, we're talking about now retaliating via like words and stuff and always defend people just going back and forth, attacking one another, like how does that look to the rest of the world or even new Christians?
Right.
I think that's something to be considered.
It does. I believe, and I've said this to you privately, but social media is going to send a lot of people to hell. And I know that's rough to hear. We're using social media right now.
Yeah.
But we have to understand that if the works of the flesh are division and strife and heresies and all this envy, like jealousies and outbursts of wrath and all this fighting, we export that to an exponential level when we do it on social media.
Yeah.
And if God hates it between you and me, how much more so when we're sharing it with the whole world?
Right. We're gonna have to be careful about that, and this is election season's coming up.
We're gonna have to Lord, help us, please.
Yeah. Your brother, you say your brother says, spreading more heat than light.
Oh yeah, generating more heat
than light.
Yeah. My brother Mark, he always has these neat statements. My brother's so wise, but he just said, Aaron, this is generating more heat than light, and I'm like, that is exactly what is happening, and it happens in the home, it happens wherever else. We're generating more heat than light. I was thinking about something. We still got a couple minutes, but
yeah,
in 2 Corinthians 11, in the middle of him defending himself, right? He's saying, why? Because in verse 2, I feel a divine jealousy for you since I betrothed you to one husband to present you as a pure virgin to Christ. I'm afraid, right? You're going to be led astray from sincere and pure devotion to Christ. That gives the context for his defense.
Yes.
And then you read why he's defending himself. Always keep that in mind. There's a reason he's defending himself. It's not because Paul has a fragile ego that we have to nurse along.
Right.
It's because, which that's true of me at times. I hate that, but that's true of me, and that's the thing is Paul's like, I'm not doing it because of that. I'm doing it because souls are at stake. And I'm really concerned about these people losing their souls.
Yeah.
And my authority as an apostle is tied to the validity of the gospel I preached. And so if that's undermined, they won't listen to the gospel. And that's why. And I know we've already said that, but you just look at 2 Corinthians 11, you can see. And another thing in 2 Corinthians 11 is he talks about all of his sufferings. If we're going to be upset with something, let's not be upset with ourselves being hurt. Look at what upset Paul. I want you to see this in verse 28 and 29 of 2 Corinthians 11. And apart from other things, amidst all of his shipwrecks and beatings and among other things, there's the daily pressure of me on my anxiety for all the churches. Who is weak and I am not weak? Who is made to fall and I am not indignant? If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. And again, he's explaining why I'm doing this. He is hot mad.
Yeah.
And if we're going to be hot mad, hot angry, let's be angry over souls that are being lost.
Yeah.
Okay. And that can be through a false gospel being preached, or that can also be through strife on social media or anywhere else in a church. And if there's anything we need to be angry about, it's that.
Yeah.
Paul would be angry about that.
Right.
So if we're going to defend ourselves, let's make sure we're doing it to further the gospel, not to further our character and our reputation. And that's in any setting. That could be in the home. Maybe Anna, my wife, tells me something I need to hear, and I don't like it. I don't like the way it come across or whatever, but maybe I needed to hear it. And so I'm going to make it more about other issues, or maybe how she said it, or which I've done, instead of wow, what she told me. I needed to hear that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, anyway, and then when you argue in front of the kids, and what are you teaching the kids? In the same way, when we're arguing on social media as brothers, what are we teaching the world?
All right.
So anyway,
right.
Yeah, but that's it. Think about that. And so
Yeah.
Ruben, you did an awesome job. Thank you.
Thanks.
That I think that helps to line this out and to kind of give us a base and a context where we can know when to retaliate, when to defend, when to stand up, and when to say, okay, we're going to let this go and I'm going to walk away.
Yeah.
So I think it gives us a good foundation to go there.
Oh, cool. That's all I got. Yeah. Just, I would encourage people, this is going to take discernment. Some people are going to make decisions over here where they defend themselves here, and some people might choose differently. And so it's going to take discernment, but hopefully we've given you some tools or principles to be able to walk that path of discernment.
Yep.
So
Amen.
that's all I got.
All right. Well, thank you, Ruben. So we'll look forward to being with you next week. So we'll have a prayer and then we'll close out. Our Father in heaven, thank you so much for this time. Thank you for Ruben and his diligence to study your word and his ability to teach. We thank you, Father, for this time together, that we can look at these things. Help us to have the right heart and expose our heart, Father, and show us where we need to grow. And we pray, Father, that we will have the heart of Jesus, the heart of Paul, and that we will stand up when we need to, that we will show the Spirit of Christ and be forgiving and turn the other cheek when we need to, and we'll